This podcast series is part of the mission of the New York Intellectual Property Law Association, NYIPLA Past Presidents Committee, to preserve a snippet of the history of our association through the eyes of our past presidents and to provide continuity for our century-old association's values and traditions for future NYIPLA leaders. Today, we are pleased to have with us Dale Carlson. He was the 88th president of NYIPLA, and he served during the 2010 to 2011 term. Welcome, Dale. It's great to see you, and I look forward to a wonderful discussion. As we start, Dale, please tell us a little about who you are and where you are in your career today.
Sounds good. Yeah. So I've had an extensive and very interesting career. My first 20 years were in corporate practice, first with the Union Carbide and then with Olin Corporation, starting in Manhattan and then in Connecticut. During the early years in the corporate practice, that's when I started to get involved in the association. And my very first memory of the association was the 1976 Judges Dinner. I was fresh to Carbide. They said, well, if you're in corporate practice, you don't need to wear a tux. You can wear a business suit, and that's fine. So why don't you just come along with us? And a whole group of us walked right across the street on Park Avenue to the Waldorf. And that was my first recollection of the association. And shortly thereafter, I signed up to get involved. And I can tell a couple of stories about how the early years went. But so today, you asked, Rob, what do I do now? I head up the IP concentration at Quinnipiac Law School, and I've been this 2024 is a landmark year for me in many respects because it's my 25th year of teaching at Quinnipiac.
Wow!
And so I started in 2000 when I was at Wigan and Dana. So I went from corporate practice for a couple of decades to private practice for a couple of decades with Wigan and Dana in New Haven. And so in 2000, spring of 2000, I taught my first IT class at Quinnipiac. And 3 years later, Evelyn Sommer, who was on the board of directors of the NYIPLA the first time I was on the board, 1988 to 91, she was retiring from teaching. And they asked, could I teach the patent course also, in addition to the IP survey course? So 3 years after, that would have been 2003, I started teaching the patent course. And then at the end of 2013, I retired from Wigan and Dana as head of the patent practice group there after 20 years. And Quinnipiac asked whether I would come full-time to teach full-time. So now, these days, beginning in 2014, I went full-time. I head up the IP concentration. I teach the IP survey course, and I teach patents and advanced patents as well.
Wow!
That's the story.
No, that sounds terrific. Before we move on to any other questions, moving from law practice to academia, I'm sure you have lots of thoughts about, the differences between practice and being in academia. But is there one particular difference that you think stands out among the most?
I think that my students really appreciate sort of the real world aspect that I bring to the table. Many of my colleagues on the full-time faculty have never done anything but teach. And so they've had no real world experience. And my students seem to really appreciate that real world experience. And I'm so happy to say that at your installation in May, one of my students won the Connor Writing Competition Award. Hannah Scott is her name, and she wrote on IP in the context of tattoos. My wife and I were so happy to be there, and so happy that it was a blind competition. I think that's a better way to go. That the judges do it blindly. They don't know what the school is. They don't know who the person is, whether it's male or female or who it might be. And so Hannah and her husband were there, along with myself and my wife. And we were also very impressed to watch your fireside chat with Judge O'Malley. I thought that was very well done and much appreciated. So,
Well, thank you for that, Dale. Okay, so how did you first become aware of NYIPLA?
well, the first awareness was the judge's dinner. It was a real party. And one of my history columns, you know, in my role as historian, 2024 is landmark in that respect because it's my 20th year as historian for the NYIPLA. And if you go through those columns, and I hope the listeners to this podcast do go through some of those history columns, the Historian's Corner columns, you will find that I write about my experiences even at the first judge's dinner and what happened at that first judge's dinner. Winding down the wide staircase at the Waldorf at 1 o'clock in the morning, the party was finishing up.
Yeah, no, I understand. When did you first become involved with the association?
So the first time I got involved with the association, I had, fortunately, when I was finishing up law school at Syracuse, my JD program, I got an article published then, and that sort of led to much more publishing happening coming out of that law journal article. So a couple of years out of law school, I published an article that appeared in the New England Law Review, and it also appeared in what was called the Journal of the Patent Office Society, which is now called the Journal of the Patent and Trademark Office Society. And that article was on best mode in patent practice, and that led to an invitation from the Meetings and Forums Committee chair, who at the time is the past president, Pat Rosano, but he was at that time, early in his career, he was chair of the Meetings and Forums Committee. And so he invited me to give a talk, and these were luncheon presentations that were given maybe half a dozen times a year at various university clubs in the city. And this one was going to be at the Williams Club. So it would be lunch followed by a talk, and I was to give the talk. And so I met Pat Rosano over at his law firm. I walked from 270 Park Avenue, Carbide, over to Curtis Morris in Stafford, where he was at the time. And on the way over to the Williams Club, he said, well, have you ever done this kind of thing before? And I said, no. And you could just see he was scared in his boots at that point. And I was scared myself. And I didn't touch the food for lunch. There were 70 people at that gathering. I probably was the youngest person at the gathering. And it was standing room only. There weren't even enough seats in the room. And so had I not written out my presentation the night before, I would have frozen. There's no doubt I would have frozen because I just felt so inexperienced and all. And then at the end of the whole thing, there were several questions, but the most memorable one was from Carl Jorda, another past president, who had been writing about secret prior art. And he asked this long-winded question about secret prior art in the context of best mode. It went on for 2 or 3 minutes. And I didn't understand a word he said. And so I said, could you repeat the question? And this fellow in the back of the room raised his hand and said, can I try to answer Carl's question? And he gave this brilliant answer. And afterwards, I went up and I thanked him. I said, you saved me. You really
A lifesaver. Yeah.
And I said, who are you? And he said, my name is J. Philip Anderegg. I'm with Penny and Edmonds, and I'm on the board of directors here of the association. And a couple of months later, an AIPLA journal article came out on international aspects of best mode, published, written by J. Philip Anderegg.
Oh, okay.
So that was my beginning.
That's a great story. We probably know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. What inspired you to join the NYIPLA?
I think it was considered the outstanding association in the region, actually, certainly in Manhattan. And I was told I could join 2 associations for free. In other words, Carbide would pay for 2. And it was strongly urged that this be one of the 2. I know that my boss at the time was Tom O'Brien, who headed up the 65-person patent group at Carbide at 270 Park Avenue. And he was a big proponent of the NYIPLA. And he was a big proponent of the judges' dinner. And he assigned me the task of putting together tables every year for the 10 years I was at Carbide, and managing that. And one year he was in a really bad mood, and I didn't understand it because we were in the ballroom, the grand ballroom, and I didn't understand what was going on. And I said, we're in the grand ballroom, and he said, well, if you pull these drapes in front of us, we're not in the ballroom anymore because it was so far. It was the last set of tables in the very back of the room.
Yeah.
So anyway.
So
yeah.
what activities and roles did you engage in early on as a member?
Yeah. So one activity that I can never forget, and but I blocked it out of my brain until a few minutes ago, is that I was a member of the Patent Antitrust Subcommittee of the Antitrust Committee of the NYIPLA. And Bob Nooner, another past president, was chair of that subcommittee then. And during the winter and the spring, the fall and the spring, he would have monthly meetings, and they were held at his law firm, which is Brumbaugh, Graves, and Donahue in Rockefeller Center.
Yep.
Up at the top of Rockefeller Center. And so we had these monthly meetings, and take the elevator up, get off, go into the meeting room, and there would be sandwiches and that sort of thing. But interestingly, even Graves, Mr. Graves, who was in his 80s at the time, would sit in the corner of the room at every one of those meetings, never said a word. Everyone would file in and say, good afternoon, Mr. Graves. Everyone would be sort of bow to Mr. Graves, and that was how each meeting began. But I remember vividly that the December 1979 meeting, and the reason why I remember the December 1979 meeting of the Patent Antitrust Subcommittee with Bob Nooner was that I walked into the room, and one of the members of the committee, Bill Burnett, said, Dale, I can't believe you published that piece. And I had just published a piece in the first year of the National Law Journal, first year that it was ever published. And you could buy them on the street. You just put coins in a slot and buy the National Law Journal. And I wrote an article, and it was entitled, New Patent Court, It's a Good Idea. This was 1979, before the Federal Circuit was created in 1982.
Sure.
And Bill Burnett said, how dare you do it? You knew that this committee is opposed to that court. And I said, well, I didn't write it on behalf of the committee. But I was sort of snubbed for the rest of that meeting, I guess.
Wow. That's very interesting. Okay. So did there come a time when you decided you wanted to assume a leadership role, or did it evolve over time?
I think what happened was the day that I gave that presentation at the Williams Club, at the end of that presentation, David Kane came up to me and gave me his business card. He was with his dad and uncle's firm at the time called Kane Dalsimer. And he and Seagrin Kane she's a trademark expert, and he's a trademark expert also. They both were with that firm. And after he gave me his business card, he said, maybe we could get together for lunch or something one day. And he wanted me to get involved in this, the Meetings and Forums Committee, which did the fall annual IP practice gathering, a weekend gathering. The first of which was held in Westchester at Arrowwood, a conference center in Westchester, Rye City, I think. That was in 1984. So that was the very first one. And after that, David King and his uncle and his dad and his family had been going to a place called Skytop in the Poconos for their whole life, ever since, I guess, David was a kid. And so he wanted to go there. So our next 3 annual meetings, all on Veterans Day weekend, so that would have been 85, 86, and 87, were all held at Skytop in the Poconos. And then after that, Mohawk Mountain House came up as being a place to be, a place to go to. And so 88, 89, 90, we went to Mohawk Mountain House for the fall seminar on Veterans Day weekend. And by that time, my wife-to-be was with me, and she and I got to know lots of folks pretty well. Ginger and I got to know lots of folks pretty well, including David and Stigrin and others. I remember playing ping pong and billiards with John Sweeney's kids, for example. It was just a very fun, and also you really develop relationships with colleagues in the field.
Sure. Well, you never know, maybe we could bring that back. So let's talk about your time as president. What was your trajectory in the organization leading you to becoming the president?
Yeah, it was a very strange trajectory. It was non-traditional in almost every respect. I wasn't towing any party line. I wasn't in any firm that was clamping down on what I could do or say. I was, at the first time, it was 1988 to 91, and I was with Olin Corporation. The Bhopal explosion for carbide had happened. Carbide folks scattered to the winds. I went to Olin Corporation in Cheshire at that point. And so for those first 3 years that I was on the board, I may have been selected because I was in corporate practice and they were looking for corporate practitioners to be on the board. So that's how I got involved the first time. And then a decade and a half later, if you can imagine this, I got a call, and it was from John Murnane. And he said, we'd like you to be on the board. This was 2004. And I said, I've already been on the board. You may not know that. And he said, oh, we know all about that. He said, we want somebody that has experience in the organization to get involved again. So that's how that happened. So that ran from 2004 to 2007. And then at the end of that time, the issue was I going to have any other slot? And I got another call from John Murnane. He said, the nominating committee wants you to be treasurer. Will you agree to that? And I said, sure, I can do that. And then 2 weeks later, Ed Vasallo called. Ed Vasallo was the one that ultimately got me to be historian, asked that I be historian. He called and he said there was a passing of one of the other nominees for a position. Would you agree to John Daniel, who was a great person, a really wonderful person? He died of a sudden heart attack. And so would you agree to go on the ladder and be second vice president, which is how that all came about. So.
Oh, okay, interesting. Excuse me, before we get into some specifics about your presidency, can you give us a general overview of the intellectual property landscape in terms of the issues confronting the IP community during the time that you were president?
Yes, it was a very challenging time. I knew it was going to be a challenging time. And the main thing was the Great Recession was in full force. Great Recession was causing lots of financial issues for many organizations. Our organization, the NYIPLA, was under financial pressure, and it looked like it was bleeding money, basically, at that time. And so the issue at hand, at the time that I was about to become president, I was about to be installed, was real strong budgetary problems. And so myself, the treasurer at the time, her name was Alice Brennan. She was a great treasurer. She never got onto the ladder, but she was served very, very well as treasurer. And the person who was going to succeed me as president, Teresa Gillis, they were ones that really were forces to be reckoned with when it came to making fiscally responsible decisions. And one of those fiscally responsible decisions was to change the executive director because it wasn't going right in the right direction the way it was. And so we interviewed several organizations, one of which was RRR, Robin Rolfe at the time, and Feike Van Ryn. And it was going to be a close question. I knew it was going to be a close question, but I think the three of us together, myself, Alice Brennan, and Terry Gillis, were able to convince the board that the time had come, that this had to happen, the transition had to happen. Now, unfortunately, the former executive director was still in charge, so to speak, up until the time of my installation as president. So my installation as president was at the Union League Club, and it could have been utter chaos because there was no assistance provided that evening for, you know, where do we get the pictures taken, who gives presentation, what's the agenda for the meeting, where are the beverages going to be served, nothing at all. So we were blindsided.
Wow.
But we got through it. We got through it, and it worked out. So that was how I came into the position. So by the time after that night, then Feike's organization was in charge, and thankfully things went swimmingly well under her leadership, and Robin at the time. It went very well, such that by the end of my administration, we had $1.5 million in the coffers. Really
Well, that's
tough,
terrific.
really.
Yeah, and I can say from my own personal experience, I'm sure you made many valuable decisions, but by far that was the best decision that came out of your presidency.
It worked out really well, and I'm
Yeah.
very proud of that. I'm proud of a few other things as well when we get into talking about the judge
Sure.
dinner and that kind
Sure,
of thing.
but you know, my point being that they just served us so well, and I don't know how we would get on without them.
I agree, and I honestly think had it gone the way some were pushing, I would say half the board was pushing in a different direction. I think the whole thing would have gone down, actually.
I don't doubt it. Okay, so do you have any specific goals or a mission that you wanted to accomplish during your time as president? And if so, what were they?
So there were several things. My heroes in the field of intellectual property, specifically patents, I have two heroes. I tell my classes I have two heroes. One is Judge Giles Rich, and the other is Judge Pauline Newman.
Yep.
They both have served very well, and I've always thought that they both have served in the best interests of the profession rather than any individual or any company or anything like that. And so Judge Rich has been called the father of modern patent law because he was a key co-author of the Patent Act of 1952. And that's only because of his ascendancy through the ladder of the NYIPLA. He got national attention through the NYIPLA, through testimony before Congress and that kind of thing. So he was president exactly 60 years before I was. So it was like the diamond anniversary of his presidency, 1950-51. So I wanted to honor him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. He received other awards, but he hadn't received that one. So I wanted to do it posthumously, and I got knowledge that his granddaughter was a first-year law student at NYU at the time.
Ah.
And her great-grandfather attended the first judge's dinner on December 6, 1922, at the Waldorf Astoria, when the Waldorf Astoria was located where the Empire State Building is now. And so I wanted to honor Judge Rich, and I was able to do it through the vehicle of presenting a Steuben glass piece to his granddaughter. And at that dinner, half of Judge Rich's clerks He was a judge for 43 years. 20 of them were at that judge's dinner. I thought was wonderful, remarkable.
Sure. Oh, that's tremendous. So from your perspective, what was your greatest accomplishment or proudest moment during your time as president? You may have already told us, but
Well, I have to say that that John Sweeney was, and both John Sweeney and Ed Vasello have passed away recently. They're gone now, so we can't talk to them. But John Sweeney said, well, if you want a really good speaker, keynote speaker at your judge's dinner, you should go for Judge John Gleason, who was at the time in the Eastern District of New York.
yeah, I know.
And that was just the luckiest moment for me because he gave the most brilliant speech. And I've heard pretty much every speech since 1976. I know the really good ones. And one of the really good ones was Judge Mulligan, who spoke not once, not twice, but 3 times as a keynote speaker at
Wow.
the judge's dinner. Twice while he was a judge and once when he was dean at Fordham, I believe. And then it was followed by Judge McLaughlin, who also was dean at Fordham. But Judge McLaughlin only did it once, but they were really great speakers, great after-dinner keynote speakers. But I think Judge Gleason really took down the house that night.
You certainly
And
did.
if any of the watchers of this program want to see what Judge Gleason had to say, and it's well worth reading it again, even if you heard it at the time, you can go right to the April-May 2011 issue of both NYIPLA Bulletin, which is now called the NYIPLA Report. But if you go to that issue, it's available online under resources. You will find Judge Gleason's speech and how brilliant and interesting it was.
Yeah, it was. So during your presidency, what was your greatest challenge?
Well, it was really, I knew that I was going to be facing some headwinds in regard to this whole fiscal reform thing. I was going to face headwinds, and I did throughout the time. But I was able to deal with those headwinds, largely thanks to the support from Teresa Gillis and Alice Bryman and probably my wife behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
So that we were able to make these changes. And one of the changes that was also resisted was the change from the Green Book publication to the Green Booklet. Now, when the Green Books were being published, they were a very thick volume, all the membership, all the names of everybody, all the reports from the committees and all the past officers listed and all that kind of thing. It was very nice, but it was very expensive, and it would come out a year behind schedule. In other words, by the time the Green Book would come out, it was already out of date. It was already dated. So the idea with the Green Booklet was to have something that is more picture intensive, easier to put together, and that you could put out on a shoestring budget compared to the enormous sums of money that we paid for the other. So that was I faced a lot of obstacles in that respect also, but we were able to convince half of the board, or I guess one more than half of the board,
Yeah.
in each of these situations. But you can see in retrospect, it was really a time of immense change.
Yeah. So, you've talked a lot about some really brilliant and exciting moments during your presidency. Can you just point to one fondest memory?
I think that the fondest memory probably came in the end. And that would be, you can read about it in that same issue that Judge Gleason's speech is presented. It's my president's column, and it sort of flashes back to the blue skies, that everything went beautifully well. But actually, at the time things were evolving, it was not at all clear that things were going to go there were a lot of there was a lot of sort of under the table stuff going on that made the likelihood of blue skies very remote possibility. I wanted to mention also that during my year as president, I couldn't be historian also because I had to do the president's column. And John Pegram kindly agreed to be interim historian for that year. And if the listeners and watchers of this program want to get some really good insight into what it was like to be a lawyer in private practice in the 1960s, I would say look at John Pegram's history columns for 2010, 2011. They're really well done.
Oh, that's great. So what advice can you give our younger or newer members of NYIPLA if they aspire to assume a leadership role or to one day maybe become president of NYIPLA?
Yeah, I would say, we need to encourage them, just get involved. Just get involved maybe in the young lawyers group or at one of the summer gatherings, the cocktail gatherings that the NYIPLA offers. Hopefully they can get free membership during their time if possible for a student role. And then you never know where it's going to lead, but where it will likely lead is that you will develop contacts, relationships that will last you a lifetime. And really the IP profession and the patent profession, trademarks, copyrights, they're very small groups. A lot of it is concentrated in New York. And so, just jump in, volunteer to do anything, to get involved in any of the committees, and see where it leads. And it may lead you to very good things. And also, I would encourage them to try to publish, because I think that you become an instant expert in the field if you can do that at any age, even when you're first starting out. And I think from the association's vantage point, we should do everything we can to encourage, maybe through the professors around the region. I was the first president from a Connecticut law firm in the history of the association. Others, became president and then moved to Connecticut after they were president. Maybe went to a Connecticut firm later. But I was the first in history. And for those that don't know it, our geographic reach, our real reach probably goes way beyond, but our geographic reach covers the Second Circuit and New Jersey, which includes New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, and Vermont. And so, the schools within that region particularly, I think that the IT professors should be encouraged to get their students involved, particularly if they're thinking of working in New York.
Absolutely. No, I agree. Well, you've given great advice, for our younger and newer members. And I think that advice also applies to how they can get the most benefit from their membership in the NYIPLA. Is there anything that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that, with where we are now post-pandemic and, the Zoom gatherings and virtual gatherings and that sort of thing, it raises the question in terms of the association's long-term strategy. If they're thinking strategically long-term, how can the association replicate the amazing things that happened when we had a weekend in the Catskills or a weekend in the Poconos, which maybe it's impossible to do that now. And one of the past presidents reached out to me recently, Tom Creel, to ask about the golf outings. When were the golf outings held? And the golf outings were typically held in the springtime, whereas the weekend seminars were typically held in the fall. But there would be golf there too, golf and tennis and that sort of thing. And there were dinner dances. We don't have any of that now. So the question from the association, for the association to consider is, how do we get that mix of interaction now that the pandemic is gone? Can it be something like a day in the country where where everybody goes up to Mohawk. And if you're in Westchester or New Jersey, it's a very short trip to Mohawk or to Sky Top. It's like an hour. That's it.
Yeah.
You know, can have a day in the country or something similar to that. Now, when I was first installed as president, I knew it was going to be a tough year. And so in September of that year, I encouraged the past presidents, particularly the more senior past presidents, to come to a luncheon that I would host at Wigan and Dana. At the time, Wigan had offices at 45th and Madison, which is above a tower above the old post office there.
Yep.
At 45th and Madison. And so about 15 past presidents came to that lunch. And so the objective was to get ideas about what they were thinking should happen during that year, but also to sort of solidify support from them for what I knew was going to be a somewhat tumultuous year. And it was,
Sure.
and they did provide the support that I needed when I needed it.
Well, you may or may not know, I'm trying to bring the golf outing back, and I've established the past presidents committee. So we're in sync in that manner and in that way. Okay.
That's great.
Any final thoughts as we wrap up this interview?
No, just it's a wonderful association. I'm glad that it came through the pandemic okay, in solid footing. I think there'll be further solid footing developing over time, and wishing the best for the future.
Well, that's wonderful. And thank you so much for participating in this, Dale. This was a great interview. And I know I neglected to introduce myself. At the beginning of this podcast, I'm Rob Rando, and I am the current president of NYIPLA for the 2023-2024 term. Thank you, and we're done.
Thank you very much. Bye, Rob.
Bye-bye.